The Wyoming sun blazed mercilessly overhead as Clara Bell collapsed to her knees in the brittle grass, her fingernails scraping against the hard-pan earth as she forced herself to crawl forward. Every movement sent lightning bolts of agony through her twisted ankle, while the deep gash across her thigh had long since soaked through the makeshift bandage torn from her petticoat. 21 years old, and already hollow-eyed from suffering, she had been fleeing for 3 days across the endless plains, her simple cotton dress now little more than blood-stained rags clinging to her trembling frame. The bone-deep exhaustion threatened to drag her into unconsciousness. But the distant sound of baying hounds carried on the scorching wind, kept terror pumping through her veins. Mayor Amos Price's hunting party was closing in, their voices echoing across the barren landscape like the cries of demons seeking vengeance. She could hear them coordinating their search, spreading out to cover more ground, and their rifles glinting like deadly promises in the harsh sunlight that turned the prairie into a furnace of desperation. Clara's vision blurred as dehydration took its toll, but through the heat shimmer, she spotted Salvation, an ancient stone well rising from the endless expanse of yellowed grass like a monument to hope itself. The circular structure, weathered smooth by decades of prairie storms, seemed to dance in the waves of superheated air that rose from the baked earth. Her cracked lips moved in silent prayer as she dragged herself toward it, leaving a trail of crimson droplets in the dust that told the story of her desperate flight. As she reached the well's weathered stone rim and peered into its shadowy depths, Clara saw her own gaunt reflection fractured on the dark water below. The sight triggered a flood of memories, her mother's gentle voice describing this very well during long winter evenings, speaking of Spanish missionaries who had built it as a way station for travelers crossing the vast emptiness. "Water is life itself, my dear Clara," her mother had whispered during those precious moments before prairie fever claimed her. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places, carried by the kindness of strangers or the mercy of God himself. With hands that shook so violently she could barely grip the rope, Clara lowered the wooden bucket into the cool darkness. The first taste of water was like liquid salvation washing away the dust and fear that had sustained her through 72 hours of nightmare. She drank desperately, not caring that half of it spilled down her chin and onto her torn bodice, tasting the mineral richness that spoke of deep springs and ancient aquifers that had sustained life in this desolate place for countless generations. The silence that followed her frantic drinking was broken only by the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead and the whisper of wind through the prairie grass. But Clara's heightened senses, sharpened by days of constant danger, detected something else, the almost imperceptible sound of movement in the tall buffalo grass not 20 feet away. Her blood froze as a shadow fell across the well, and from the grass stepped a figure that transformed her moment of relief into renewed terror. A Cheyenne warrior, his bronze skin marked with traditional white and black war paint in intricate patterns she didn't recognize, emerged with the silent grace of a hunting cat. A Winchester rifle was leveled directly at her chest, his dark eyes studying her with the calculating intensity of a predator, deciding whether prey was worth the effort of killing. This wasn't their first encounter during her 3-day flight. Clara had caught glimpses of this same figure, a dark silhouette moving parallel to her path, always maintaining distance, sometimes visible on distant ridges like a patient hunter stalking wounded game. For what seemed like eternity, neither moved. The rifle's muzzle never wavered as the warrior's gaze took in her obvious injuries, her torn dress, and the blood-stained letters she still clutched in her trembling hand. Clara waited for the scalping knife for the savage brutality that frontier newspapers described in lurid detail. Instead, she heard something that shocked her to her core, carefully pronounced English words that cut through her terror like sunlight through storm clouds. "You carry papers from the fat white chief who kills our people." Clara Bell's life had been measured in other people's expectations since the day she learned to walk. Born to struggling homesteaders in the hardscrabble town of Milbrook, Wyoming Territory, She was the only child of Henrik Bell, a man whose dreams had withered like his crops under the relentless prairie sun. Her mother, Anna, had been the light of their modest household, a woman who could find beauty in a wildflower and hope in the darkest winter storm. But when Clara turned 15, she watched that light slowly fade as prairie fever consumed her mother's fragile strength, leaving behind only a worn Bible, a silver locket, and memories of gentle hands that had once braided her hair with infinite patience. The loss had broken something fundamental in Henrik Bell. Where once he had spoken of building a better life for his family, now he saw only debts mounting like storm clouds on the horizon. The drought of 1886 had been the final blow, destroying their corn crop for the second consecutive year and leaving him drowning in obligations to Milbrook's merchants. Their 40-acre homestead was unremarkable, stubborn soil that barely yielded enough to survive in good years, but it held one prize that made it valuable. It bordered the expanding ranch empire of Mayor Amos Price and controlled access to a year-round creek that fed into the larger water system. Price was Milbrook's undisputed ruler, a thick-bodied man of 50 whose cold gray eyes and soft hands belied the ruthless ambition that had built his fortune from nothing. He controlled the town's bank, owned the largest general store, held mortgages on half the surrounding farms, and maintained a network of hired enforcers who ensured that his business dealings went smoothly. More importantly, he possessed the kind of patient cruelty that allowed him to smile warmly at Sunday services while systematically destroying anyone who stood in his way. The arrangement that would seal Clara's fate had been discussed in whispered conversations between Henrik and Price's representatives for weeks before she learned of it. In exchange for Clara's hand in marriage, all of Henrik's debts would be forgiven, and he would receive enough money to relocate to California without Clara. The deal perfectly served Price's dual ambitions, acquiring a young wife to cement his social standing while gaining control over the Bell property's crucial water rights that were essential to his planned cattle expansion into the northern ranges. But it was the discovery of Price's letter that had transformed Clara from a resigned victim into a desperate fugitive. The night before her planned escape, while Henrik drowned his guilty conscience in Price's whiskey, Clara had systematically searched his desk for anything that might aid her survival. Hidden beneath a stack of unpaid bills, she had recovered her mother's precious silver locket and a bone-handled skinning knife that had belonged to her grandmother. But it was the letter tucked beneath Henrik's leather ledger that had made her blood run cold and changed everything. The envelope bore Mayor Price's official seal, and though Clara had been raised never to read private correspondence, desperation overruled propriety. The letter's contents revealed corruption far beyond simple land acquisition. Price's carefully coded language referenced obstacles removed from various properties, accidents arranged for uncooperative landowners, and most chillingly specific instructions about clearing the northeast stream obstacles permanently to secure water rights for cattle expansion into Cheyenne territory. One phrase in particular had made Clara's hands shake as she read by candlelight. The situation with the Indian woman gathering herbs near our target water source has been resolved as discussed. The incident appeared accidental as required, and federal authorities have accepted our explanation of hostile activity. The creek access is now secure for surveying. The window latch had yielded to Clara's grandmother's knife after 20 minutes of careful prying, the rusted metal giving way with a soft creak that made her heart race. She had memorized every disturbing phrase in Price's letter during the sleepless hours of planning references to permanent solutions for land disputes, mentions of acceptable casualties in pursuit of expansion, and those haunting words about the Indian woman, whose death had been disguised as an accident to avoid federal investigation. Clara wrapped the letter carefully in cloth and secured it inside her corset, then gathered her meager supplies, a small pouch of dried corn that might last 2 days if rationed carefully, her mother's silver locket for whatever value it might have. In trade, the bone knife that had become her most precious possession. and a threadbare wool shawl that would provide minimal protection against the plane's unpredictable weather. Everything else, her few dresses, her books, the tintype photograph of her mother, that was her most treasured possession, had to remain behind, as evidence of a life she was abandoning forever. Using the North Star as her constant guide, Clara struck out across the moonlit landscape, following cattle trails and dry creek beds, to avoid the main roads where Price's men might spot her even in darkness. Her mother had often spoken of the old Spanish well on the abandoned Mission Trail, roughly 30 miles northeast of town, a reliable water source that marked the boundary between settled territory and the vast expanse of Cheyenne hunting grounds. If she could reach it, she might survive long enough to find help or make her way to the larger settlements along the railroad lines, where Price's influence couldn't reach her. The first night passed in a blur of determination and growing fear. Clara made good time across the gently rolling grassland, pushing herself relentlessly, while darkness provided cover from any possible pursuit. The prairie at night was a different world, entirely alive, with sounds that spoke of creatures she couldn't see. The distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of small animals in the grass, and the haunting cry of night birds created a symphony of wilderness that both comforted and terrified her. But as false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky with fingers of gold and pink, she heard the sound that transformed her escape into a desperate race for survival. The deep, resonant baying of bloodhounds carried on the morning breeze, accompanied by men's voices shouting orders in the distance. The sound hit her like a physical blow, driving home the reality that Price had organized a hunting party with professional efficiency that spoke of experience in this kind of manhunt. The Wyoming plains in August were a furnace designed to test the limits of human endurance. As the sun climbed higher on her second day of flight, Clara felt her strength being methodically drained by the relentless heat that rose from the baked earth in shimmering waves. The handful of dried corn in her pouch provided little sustenance against the demands of constant movement, while her small water flask ran dry before noon, leaving her throat raw and her tongue swollen with thirst that grew more desperate with each passing hour. The terrain revealed itself as treacherous ground, filled with hidden dangers designed to trap the unwary. Prairie dog holes threatened to snap her ankle with every step, while loose shale on the hillsides shifted treacherously underfoot, sending her sliding backward in small avalanches of stone that left fresh cuts on her hands and knees. The buffalo grass itself seemed designed to torment her, its sharp edges slicing through her thin stockings to leave a network of tiny wounds that burned with every movement and attracted clouds of biting insects. It was during the afternoon of her second day, when thirst had become a living thing clawing at her throat, that Clara remembered her mother's teachings about prairie survival. Bell had been raised on the frontier and knew which plants held water in their roots during drought seasons. Forcing herself to stop despite the urgency of her flight, Clara used her grandmother's bone knife to carefully dig around the base of a prickly pear cactus, exposing the thick taproot that her mother had described. The root yielded barely a mouthful of bitter liquid, but it was enough to ease the worst of her thirst and remind her that she was not completely helpless in this vast wilderness. Her mother's voice seemed to whisper encouragement as Clara carefully wrapped the remaining root in her torn petticoat, saving it for the next crisis that would surely come. The small victory gave her the strength to continue, and she pressed on with renewed determination, despite the pain radiating from her injured ankle. During her second afternoon of flight, Clara encountered her first serious predator. A black bear, probably weighing close to 300 pounds, had been foraging in a berry thicket when she stumbled into its territory while seeking shelter from the punishing sun. The massive animal reared up on its hind legs, standing nearly 7 feet tall, as it tested the air with flaring nostrils, trying to determine whether this strange, bloodied creature represented threat or prey. For minutes that felt like hours, woman and bear studied each other across 20 feet of open ground. Clara could see the intelligent calculation in the animal's small black eyes, weighing options with the careful deliberation of a successful predator. She remembered her father's warnings about sudden movements provoking attacks, so she remained perfectly still, despite every instinct screaming at her to run. The bear's huffing breath was audible in the still air, and she could smell its musky scent carried on the breeze. Finally, perhaps deciding that she posed no danger to its territory or cubs, the bear dropped back to all fours and ambled away into the deeper grass, leaving Clara shaking with delayed terror. But the encounter had cost precious time, and as she resumed her journey, she could hear the distant sounds of pursuit growing closer, men's voices coordinating their search, and the excited barking of tracking dogs that had found her scent trail. But there was something else following her, something that moved with purpose rather than animal instinct. Throughout her second day, Clara caught glimpses of a human figure silhouetted against distant ridges, always maintaining careful distance, sometimes visible when she crested hills. When she looked directly, it vanished like smoke, but the sensation of being watched never left her. The knowledge that something was stalking her added paranoia to her catalog of torments, but she lacked the strength to alter course or attempt evasion. It was during her descent from a rocky outcropping late on her second day that disaster struck with devastating suddenness. Exhaustion and dehydration had made Clara careless, and she failed to test what appeared to be a stable boulder before putting her full weight on it. The rock shifted beneath her with sickening suddenness, sending her tumbling down a 15-foot slope that ended with her left ankle twisted at an unnatural angle and a deep gash along her thigh that immediately began soaking her dress with blood. The searing agony was overwhelming, but the approaching sound of horses' hooves forced her to move, despite the numbing shock that threatened to drag her into unconsciousness. Through tears of pain, she could see dust clouds on the southern horizon. Price's men were gaining ground rapidly now that they had fresh blood to follow. Fighting waves of nausea from her injuries, Clara tore strips from her petticoat to bind the worst wounds, but she knew the makeshift bandages would do little to stop the bleeding that left an easily followed trail. As Clara limped forward using a broken branch as a makeshift crutch, the words from Price's letter began to echo in her mind like a deadly refrain. Obstacles removed. Acceptable casualties. Cleared permanently. She realized with growing horror that she had become one of those obstacles, another problem to be eliminated through whatever means proved most convenient. The letter had spoken of the Indian woman, with the same casual dismissal reducing a human life to nothing more than an inconvenience to be cleared away. The second night brought temperatures that plummeted with shocking suddenness, transforming the scorching plains into a landscape of bitter cold that cut through Clara's torn dress like frozen knives. She huddled in a shallow depression between two hills, pressing blood-soaked fabric against her throbbing wounds, while fighting to control the violent shivering that threatened to give away her position to anyone within hearing distance. The search party's torches flickered like malevolent stars across the darkness, their orange glow moving in systematic patterns as they combed the terrain with military precision that spoke of careful planning and unlimited resources. Clara could hear their voices with terrifying clarity carried on the thin night air, along with the excited barking of the tracking dogs that had found her blood trail hours earlier. The sound of their coordination sent ice through her veins as she realized how thoroughly they had organized her capture. "Trail's getting stronger, boss," called one of Price's men, his voice rough with whiskey and anticipation of the bounty that would come with her recapture. "Blood spores fresher too. She's hurt bad and slowing down considerable. Dogs are practically pulling us forward now." "Excellent," came Price's distinctive baritone, heavy with authority, and barely controlled fury that had been building since her disappearance became public knowledge. "Pain and exhaustion will make her more cooperative when we drag her back to face the consequences of this foolishness. I'll have a preacher waiting at the ranch, and this embarrassment will be finished before sunrise." "What about after the ceremony, Mr. Price?" asked a younger voice, more hesitant than the others. "She's just a girl, sir. Maybe if we..." She's a thief and a runaway who's cost me reputation and money." Price cut him off with vicious finality. After the wedding accidents happen to disobedient wives. Prairie life is dangerous snakes, falls, sudden illnesses, tragic encounters with hostile Indians. Very sad, but these things occur with surprising regularity to women who don't know their proper place. The casual cruelty in his tone made Clara understand with crystal clarity that her escape attempt had signed her death warrant, regardless of whether she was captured. Price couldn't afford to let her live with the knowledge contained in that letter, not when his entire criminal enterprise depended on maintaining a facade of respectability. The young voice that had tried to object fell silent, cowed by the mayor's implicit threat. When the search party finally moved on, convinced she had doubled back toward town in her desperation, Clara waited another hour before emerging from her rocky shelter. The delay cost precious time, but it also probably saved her life by ensuring the hunters were far enough away that her movements wouldn't be detected. The phrases from Price's letter continued to haunt her thoughts. Obstacles removed. Permanent solutions cleared permanently. She had seen behind the mask of civilization to the brutal calculations that drove men like Price, and the knowledge filled her with a determination that burned brighter than her physical pain. The third day became a hallucinatory nightmare of heat pain and growing desperation that pushed Clara's sanity to its breaking point. She walked through visions brought on by blood loss and dehydration, seeing her mother's face in the clouds and hearing phantom voices calling from the empty grassland. Her injured leg had grown stiff and hot to the touch. Clear signs of infection that could kill her even if she escaped Price's men and found safety among the Cheyenne. The mysterious figure continued to shadow her path throughout the day, and Clara's fevered mind began to wonder if it was real or another hallucination. She caught glimpses of it on distant hills, sometimes close enough to see that it was definitely human, but always maintaining careful distance. The knowledge that something was stalking her added a layer of paranoia to her existing torments, but she no longer had the strength to care whether it represented additional danger or potential salvation. During the hottest part of the afternoon, when the sun seemed determined to bake her brain inside her skull, Clara spotted something that made her wonder if she was losing her grip on reality entirely. A flock of migrating geese passed overhead, their calls echoing across the empty sky as they flew in perfect formation toward some distant destination where water and safety waited. The sight filled her with desperate hope. If the geese were flying northeast, they might be heading toward the same water source that had sustained travelers for generations. But it was the sound that accompanied the geese that truly captured Clara's attention. Mixed with their wild calling was something else, the faint but unmistakable sound of running water carried on the wind. Her heart leaped with sudden hope as she realized she must be approaching the creek system that fed the Spanish well. The knowledge gave her the strength to push through the crushing fatigue and continue her desperate journey toward salvation. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of her mother's favorite quilt, Clara finally saw it shimmering through the heat waves like a mirage made real. The ancient stone well rising from the endless grassland like a marker between the world of civilization and the vast wilderness beyond. Her legs gave out completely as relief flooded through her system, and she crawled the final 100 yards on hands and knees, tears cutting clean tracks through the grime coating her face. The water was everything Clara had dreamed it would be during her fevered journey, cool, pure, and abundant enough to wash away 3 days of accumulated dust and dried blood. She drank until her shrunken stomach could hold no more, then used her torn petticoat to clean her wounds as best she could manage. The relief was so overwhelming that for precious minutes she allowed herself to believe she might actually survive this nightmare and find a way to bring Price to justice for his crimes. The silence that followed her frantic drinking was broken only by the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead and the whisper of wind through the prairie grass. The air was thick with the scent of sage and wild herbs, while insects buzzed lazily in the afternoon heat. For the first time in 3 days, Clara felt something approaching peace, as if the ancient well held not just water, but sanctuary itself. That was when the shadow fell across the well, and her world changed forever. "I'm not his spy." Clara whispered, her voice barely audible through swollen lips that could barely form the words. "I'm trying to escape from him. My name is Clara Bell, and Mayor Price wanted to force me into marriage. I found a letter evidence of terrible things he's done." The warrior stood motionless as carved stone, his Winchester rifle trained directly on Clara's chest, while his obsidian eyes studied her with the calculating intensity of a predator evaluating potential prey. Traditional white and black war paint marked his bronze face in intricate patterns she didn't recognize, while his long black hair was braided with feathers and beads that caught the late afternoon sunlight. Everything about him spoke of deadly competence and barely restrained violence. But Clara could see intelligence in his dark eyes that gave her a sliver of hope. This close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 25, with the lean build of someone accustomed to long hunts and hard travel. His buckskin clothing was well made, but showed signs of recent use, while his moccasins were worn from many miles of tracking. The rifle in his hands was a newer model Winchester, well maintained and loaded, but his finger rested alongside the trigger guard rather than on the trigger itself, a sign that he was cautious rather than immediately hostile. "What terrible things?" he asked, his English carrying the careful precision of someone who had learned it as a second language, but spoke it well enough to conduct business with white traders and army officers. The warrior's grip on his rifle didn't waver, but Clara saw a flicker of something surprised curiosity cross his painted features. His question carried genuine interest rather than mockery, as if he already suspected what her answer might reveal. The afternoon sun cast his shadow across the well's stone rim, creating a moment frozen in time that would determine whether she lived or died in the next few minutes. With trembling hands, Clara pulled Price's letter from her corset, unfolding the blood-stained paper that had cost her everything she had ever known. The document was worse for wear after 3 days of desperate flight, stained with her sweat, and blood creased from being pressed against her body, but still legible enough to damn the man who had written it. As she began to read aloud the passages about clearing the northeast stream obstacles permanently and making the incident appear accidental to avoid federal complications, she watched the warrior's face transform with an intensity that made her heart race. The change was subtle at first, a tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible shift in his stance that spoke of muscles coiling for action. But as she continued reading, his controlled composure began to crack like ice under spring sun. When she reached the phrase about the Indian woman gathering herbs near our target water source, the warrior's hands clenched around his rifle until his knuckles went white with strain. "The Indian woman gathering herbs," he repeated slowly, his voice now heavy with grief and barely contained rage that threatened to explode into violence. "That was my sister." Clara stared at him as the horrible pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. "Your sister?" For a moment that stretched like eternity, the warrior's composure shattered completely. His face contorted with pain so raw and desperate that Clara instinctively recoiled, expecting violence born of overwhelming grief. Instead, she saw something far more dangerous, a man pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, balanced on the knife's edge between justice and revenge, seeking confirmation of what he had long suspected but been unable to prove. "Ayanna." He said the name torn from his throat like a prayer offered to the wind. She was 18 winters old, gifted in the healing arts, beloved by our people. She was gathering willow bark for winter medicines when Price's men found her near the creek that runs through this territory. They claimed she was scouting for war parties, that her death was necessary to prevent attacks on white settlements. He stepped closer to the well, his rifle now forgotten, as grief overwhelmed training and caution. The paint on his face could not hide the tears that began to gather in his dark eyes. And Clara realized she was witnessing the breakdown of a man who had carried this burden alone for too long. His voice grew harder with each word, controlled fury barely contained beneath his calm exterior. But I was hunting deer nearby when it happened. Hidden in the brush, I saw the truth of what they did to her. She carried no weapon, made no hostile moves, threatened no one with violence. She was murdered in cold blood because she had discovered their surveying activities near our sacred water source, and they could not allow word of their trespassing to reach our war council. The warrior Wicasa, he had called himself when he first spoke, reached out and snatched the letter from Clara's hands with sudden violence that made her cry out in fear. For a terrifying moment, she thought he might kill her simply for carrying evidence of his sister's murder, that her escape had led her directly into the hands of someone with even more reason to hate her than Price did. But instead of violence, she saw Wicasa's eyes fill with tears as he read the damning words for himself, his lips moving silently as he absorbed confirmation of what he had witnessed but been unable to prove. The letter validated his worst fears while providing the evidence he needed to seek justice through proper channels rather than bloody revenge. "I have been following Price's men for weeks," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion that threatened to overwhelm his careful control. "Moving like a ghost across their territory, trying to find evidence to take to the army post at Fort Laramie. Proof that would bring justice for Ayanna's death and prevent other innocents from suffering the same fate. Instead, I find you another victim of the same man's greed and cruelty." The sound of distant rifle shots cut through their conversation like thunder rolling across the plains, followed immediately by the frenzied barking of tracking dogs and shouting voices carried on the evening wind. Clara and Wicasa turned simultaneously to see dust clouds rising from the southern horizon like signals of approaching doom. Price's hunting party had found their trail and was approaching with deadly determination. "They are less than half a mile away," Wicasa said quickly, shouldering his rifle and checking its ammunition with the practiced efficiency of a warrior who had fought many battles. "And they have seen us together at the well. We must move immediately if we wish to live long enough to use this evidence against the fat chief who destroys our people." Clara struggled to stand her injured ankle's screaming protest that sent white-hot bolts of pain up her leg. But determination born of shared purpose gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. The alliance forged in mutual grief, and a common enemy had transformed her from a lone fugitive into part of something larger than herself. "Where can we go?" she asked, looking across the endless expanse of prairie that offered no obvious shelter from mounted pursuers with superior firepower. "The plains stretch forever in all directions, and they have horses while we're on foot." Wicasa pointed toward a series of rocky outcroppings to the northeast, their jagged silhouettes promising both cover and new dangers. "There is a canyon system beyond those ridges that leads toward my people's territory. Many places to hide among the rocks or make a final stand if cornered by our enemies. But we must move now before they achieve direct line of sight," as if summoned by his words. Another rifle shot cracked across the plains closer this time, and followed by Price's bellowing voice echoing off the hills with the fury of a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. "I can see them near the well, spread out and cut off all escape routes. The girl knows too much to live, and that red devil has been spying on our operations for weeks." The final chase was about to begin, and Clara realized with crystal clarity that only one side would survive to tell the story of what had transpired in this desolate place, where two wounded people had found each other and discovered that shared pain could become shared purpose. The first bullets began flying before Clara and Wicasa had covered 50 yards from the well. The sharp cracks of rifle fire, punctuated by the high whine of lead balls passing uncomfortably close to their heads. One shot splintered a weathered fence post they were using for cover, sending sharp wooden fragments spinning through the air like horizontal hail that drew blood from Clara's already injured arms and face. Wicasa returned fire with his Winchester, the disciplined shots, forcing Price's mounted men to take cover behind rocks and in shallow depressions rather than charging directly at their quarry across the open ground. His marksmanship was impressive. Clara watched him deliberately target the horses rather than the riders, understanding that disabled mounts would slow pursuit more effectively than wounded men who could still shoot from cover. "We're this way," he shouted over the increasing gunfire, grabbing Clara's arm to help her maintain pace despite her injured ankle that threatened to buckle with each step. "The canyon entrance is just beyond that ridge. If we can reach it, we will have defensive positions among the rocks." The sound of hoofbeats grew louder as Price's men spurred their horses forward, sensing that their quarry was tiring and that capture was within reach. Clara could hear individual voices, now men calling to each other, as they coordinated their final assault with the efficiency of professional hunters who had performed this type of operation many times before. But as they crested the rocky rise, both fugitives stopped dead in their tracks at the sight that greeted them below. Instead of the dry creek bed and cave system, they had expected a raging torrent of brown water filled the narrow canyon from wall to wall, a flash flood created by the violent thunderstorms that had swept across the region the previous night, while Clara hid in her depression between the hills. The flood moved with terrifying speed and raw power, carrying uprooted cottonwood trees, the bloated corpses of drowned cattle and debris from upstream settlements in its churning embrace that spoke of destruction on an enormous scale. The water was the color of chocolate, thick with mud and silt that would make swimming impossible even for the strongest person. Even if they survived the 20-foot drop into the torrent, the current would certainly batter them against the canyon walls or drag them under the muddy surface to drown in the chaos of rushing water and floating debris. Behind them, more rifle shots rang out as Price's men closed the distance. With deadly determination and their voices coordinating the final assault with military precision that spoke of experience in this kind of manhunt. Take the Indian alive. If possible, we need to know what he's seen and who else he might have told. Price's voice carried clearly over the sound of rushing water, his words revealing the calculated mind of a man who understood the broader implications of this encounter. But kill him if necessary to prevent his escape. The girl must be taken breathing, but just barely. She has information I need before she suffers an unfortunate accident. A bullet ricocheted off a boulder near Wicasa's head, and the stone fragments drawing blood from his temple and causing him to stagger momentarily while fighting to maintain his balance on the slick rocks. Clara caught his arm to steady him, her mind racing as she studied their impossible situation with the desperate clarity that comes only in moments of absolute crisis. The flood blocked their eastern escape route into Cheyenne territory, while an increasing number of armed men approached from the west with clear orders to shoot to kill. To the north and south, the canyon walls rose straight up for nearly 50 feet, offering no possible route of escape for people on foot being pursued by mounted hunters with superior firepower and numbers. The canyon wall, Wicasa said, wiping blood from his eyes as he pointed toward the northern face of the gorge, where erosion and weather had carved a series of narrow ledges and handholds into the rock. There are places where the stone has cracked from frost and rain over many seasons. If we can climb high enough, we might find another way out of this trap. Clara looked at the treacherous rock face with growing horror. Recent storms had left every surface slick with moisture and algae that would make climbing treacherous under the best conditions, while loose stones threatened to give way under climbers' weight and send them plummeting into the flood below. Her injured ankle made the prospect even more daunting, but the approaching gunfire and Price's shouted threats left them no alternatives except death or capture. They began their desperate ascent just as Amos Price himself appeared at the canyon's rim, his face purple with rage as he took personal aim with a heavy cavalry pistol that glinted wickedly in the late afternoon sunlight. The mayor's expensive clothes were torn and dusty from the hard ride, while his usually immaculate appearance had deteriorated into something approaching madness, born of obsession and wounded pride that had festered for days. "You've caused me enough trouble, girl." He roared, his voice echoing off the canyon walls with the fury of a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. "Cost me reputation time, good money, and the respect of every man in the territory. Time to end this foolishness permanently and restore the natural order." Price's first shot from the cavalry pistol went wide, the heavy bullet gouging a furrow in the rock face, mere inches from Clara's desperately gripping fingers. She could feel the heat of its passage against her cheek, could smell the acrid smoke of burned gunpowder that rose from the canyon floor on currents of air, stirred by the rushing water below. The near miss sent a shower of stone chips into her face, temporarily blinding her, but there was no time to stop and clear her vision. "Hold your positions," Price bellowed to his men, his voice cracking with strain as he fought to maintain control over a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his ability to manage. "I want information from both of them before they die. That letter contains details that could destroy everything we've built in this territory." Wicasa, blood streaming from the head wound caused by flying rock fragments, managed to raise his Winchester with shaking hands, despite his precarious position on the narrow ledge. His return shot was carefully aimed, striking one of Price's hired guns in the shoulder and sending the man tumbling backward with a scream of pain that echoed off the canyon walls like the cry of a wounded animal. But the effort cost the warrior his already tenuous grip on the slick rock face. He slipped down 8 feet before catching himself on another ledge, his rifle spinning away into the flood below, where it disappeared beneath the churning brown water, with barely a splash. Now they had no weapons, except Clara's small bone knife, facing multiple armed men, who held every advantage except the desperate courage of people with nothing left to lose. Clara watched in growing horror as more men took positions along the canyon rim, their weapons trained downward at targets trapped on the rock face, like insects caught in a spider's web. The situation appeared hopeless. They couldn't climb fast enough to escape the gunfire, couldn't defend themselves effectively against superior numbers, and couldn't retreat without falling into the deadly flood that would crush them against the rocks. That was when desperation sharpened her vision enough to spot their only possible salvation, a massive boulder easily weighing several tons, perched precariously on the cliff edge directly above their attackers. The great stone was held in place by a tangle of roots and woody vines that had been severely weakened by the recent storms and subsequent erosion, leaving it balanced on the very edge of catastrophic collapse. But as Clara began climbing toward the unstable mass with desperate determination, the situation deteriorated further. Dark clouds that had been building all day finally reached critical mass, and the sky opened with sudden violence that transformed the afternoon into a premature twilight. Rain began falling in sheets that turned the rock face into a waterfall and made every handhold treacherously slippery. The downpour worked both for and against the fugitives. It hampered their pursuers' marksmanship and reduced visibility to mere yards, but it also made climbing almost impossible and began to weaken the vegetation that held the boulder in place. The sound of thunder rolling across the plains mixed with the crack of rifle fire and the roar of rushing water to create a symphony of chaos that seemed to herald the end of the world. More ominously, Clara became aware of new sounds rising from the canyon floor. Men's voices shouting orders, the splash of boots in standing water. And most terrifying of all, the distinct sound of someone climbing up the rock face after them. The realization that their enemies were not content to wait for them to fall sent ice through her veins. Amos Price himself had descended into the canyon, his expensive boots slipping and sliding on the wet rocks as he pursued his quarry, with single-minded determination that bordered on madness. Lightning flashes revealed his face, twisted with fury, and something approaching insanity while his expensive clothing hung in tatters from his struggle against the elements and his own obsessions. "You think you can humiliate me in front of the entire territory?" He snarled through gritted teeth, his words barely audible over the thunder and rushing water. I built this town with my own hands, made myself into someone who matters. I won't be destroyed by some farmer's daughter and her pet savage. As Price closed to within 10 feet of Clara's position, she could see the murderous intent in his cold gray eyes, now wild with the desperation of a man who had staked everything on this moment. His cavalry pistol was trained on her with steady aim, despite the storm, and at this range, he couldn't possibly miss hitting something vital. But the mayor's obsession had made him reckless. In his desperate climb, he had moved beyond supporting fire from his men above, and his expensive clothing was poorly suited for rock climbing in a thunderstorm. When lightning illuminated his position, Clara could see that his left hand was bleeding from cuts inflicted by sharp stone, while his right maintained a death grip on the weapon that would end her life. I should have killed you the night I arranged our marriage, he snarled, raising the pistol for a point-blank shot. Should have put a bullet in your brain the moment you showed any sign of defiance. Would have saved us all this trouble and set a proper example for other ungrateful women. At that moment, Wicasa managed to kick loose a shower of stones from his position, above the debris, striking Price squarely in the face and causing him to lose his grip on the slick rock. But his reflexes were quicker than his bulk suggested. Even as he slid backward down the treacherous surface, he managed to fire one shot that found its mark. The bullet struck Clara in the thigh, spinning her around and causing her to lose her balance on the rain-slicked ledge. For terrifying moments that felt like hours, she dangled over the churning floodwaters by her fingertips, her injured leg useless, and her strength fading rapidly from blood loss and exhaustion. Below her, the brown torrent roared with hungry violence, ready to swallow her whole and dash her body against the rocks until nothing remained but scattered bones. Price had landed on a narrow shelf of rock and was already beginning to climb again, his pistol somehow still clutched in his bleeding hand despite his fall. His expensive coat was torn and filthy, his face a mask of blood and rainwater. But his eyes burned with undiminished hatred that transcended physical pain or rational thought. "This ends now," he screamed, raising the weapon for another shot that would finish what he had started. "I'll drag your corpse back to town as an example to anyone else who thinks they can defy the natural order." That was when Clara's frantic sawing with her grandmother's bone knife finally severed the last root holding the boulder in place. The massive stone began to move, with the slow inevitability of geological time, rolling forward from its perch with gathering momentum that shook the very foundations of the canyon wall. Price looked up just in time to see several tons of granite beginning their journey toward his position, his eyes widening with the sudden understanding that his obsession had led him to a trap he couldn't escape. His scream was cut off instantly as the boulder struck the shelf where he clung, but instead of being crushed immediately, the impact knocked him sideways into the raging flood below, where the current seized him with inexorable force. Clara watched in horrified fascination as Price was swept away by waters that cared nothing for his wealth power or murderous ambitions. For brief moments, he fought to stay afloat, his face appearing above the surface as he struggled against the inevitable with desperate fury. But the flood's power was absolute, and his heavy clothing and cavalry pistol dragged him under the muddy surface, where he vanished completely claimed by the same forces of nature he had tried to bend to his will. The boulder's continued descent sent a shower of rock fragments flying in all directions, forcing Price's surviving men to dive for cover to avoid being struck by the deadly debris. In the chaos that followed, with their leader dead and their purpose unclear, the hired guns began to retreat from the canyon rim rather than continue a fight that no longer served any master. Clara and Wicasa managed to work their way along the canyon wall to where erosion had created a crude stairway of stone ledges leading to safety above. Every movement was agony for Clara, her wounded leg leaving a trail of blood on the rocks, but the knowledge that they had survived filled her with strength that transcended physical pain. The boundary markers of Cheyenne territory stood like sacred sentinels in the gray dawn light, tall poles adorned with eagle feathers, painted symbols and medicine bundles that marked the edge of a world governed by different laws and customs. Beyond them lay a landscape that appeared identical to the plains they had just crossed. But Clara understood she was looking at sanctuary, a place where the remnants of Price's organization would not dare to follow. Behind them, the sounds of confusion and retreat grew fainter as the mayor's remaining hired guns discovered their employer's fate and faced the sobering reality of continuing without pay leadership or clear purpose. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and cool, but it had also washed away most traces of the pursuit that had consumed 4 days and fundamentally changed the lives of everyone involved. They will not cross the boundary, Wicasa explained as they staggered past the territorial markers, both of them barely able to walk from exhaustion injuries and the emotional shock of their narrow escape from death. Price might have been fool enough to risk war with my people over land and water rights, but his hired men understand the consequences of provoking a conflict without proper leadership or army support. Clara looked back to see the last of the mounted figures disappearing into the distance, their silhouettes growing smaller against the morning sky as they retreated toward Milbrook with news that would shock the territory. She could imagine the conversations that would follow. Some would mourn Price as a pillar of the community destroyed by savage violence, while others would whisper about justice finally catching up with a man whose methods had long been questioned in private. As they crossed into Cheyenne lands, Clara felt a complex mixture of relief, gratitude, and apprehension about what lay ahead. She was safe from immediate recapture, and the threat of forced marriage had died with Price in the flood, but her future remained completely uncertain. Would Wicasa's people view her as an ally who had helped expose their enemies' crimes, or as a potential threat who knew too much about their territory and defenses? "What will happen to me now?" she asked as they walked slowly across the rolling grassland, supporting each other when the pain became too much to bear alone. "That depends on what the council decides after they hear your story and examine the evidence you carry." Wicasa replied with honesty that she appreciated, even as it increased her anxiety. "You have proven yourself an enemy of our enemy, which carries weight among my people. But you are also a white woman fleeing from her own kind, and some will question whether your presence here serves our interests or creates new dangers." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, not the heavy thunder of pursuit, but the lighter rhythm of unshod ponies moving at an easy pace that spoke of routine patrol rather than urgent mission. A group of Cheyenne warriors appeared over a low ridge, their painted faces and traditional weapons making Clara's heart race with renewed fear, despite Wicasa's reassuring presence beside her. The lead warrior, a man of perhaps 40 winters with scars that spoke of many battles, rode directly to Wicasa and began speaking rapidly in the Cheyenne language. His tone was urgent as he gestured toward the boundary markers and the dust cloud still visible in the distance, clearly seeking information about the disturbance that had brought armed white men so close to their territory. Wicasa replied in the same tongue, holding up Price's blood-stained letter and pointing to Clara's obvious injuries as evidence of the story he was telling. The exchange continued for several minutes, with other warriors occasionally adding questions or comments that Clara couldn't understand but could interpret from their body language and expressions. Finally, the lead warrior nodded and spoke a few words that seemed to settle the immediate question of Clara's fate, at least temporarily. "Running Bear says we are expected," Wicasa translated with obvious relief. "Scouts reported the pursuit and the rockfall that killed the fat chief in the canyon. The council has already been told of these events and has decided to hear your story and examine the evidence you carry before determining what should be done." 8 months had passed since Clara's desperate flight across the Wyoming plains, 8 months during which her life had been transformed in ways she could never have imagined when she first slipped through her father's window into the darkness beyond Milbrook. The Cheyenne village had become her home through a gradual process of acceptance that began with her willingness to share her limited education with children, eager to learn about the rapidly changing world around them. Her modest schooling acquired during sporadic attendance at Milbrook's overcrowded schoolhouse proved invaluable to a community seeking to better understand the complex legal and political systems that increasingly affected their lives and their relationship with the expanding white settlements. In exchange, the village women taught her traditional skills that connected her to the land in ways her frontier upbringing had never allowed. Beadwork that required infinite patience and precision hide tanning that demanded both physical strength and accumulated knowledge passed down through generations, and herbal medicine that revealed wisdom about the natural world that had been carefully observed and preserved for centuries. The children were her greatest joy and her most demanding teachers. They possessed an insatiable curiosity about the world beyond their territory, asking questions that forced Clara to examine her own assumptions about civilization progress and the relationship between different peoples. "Tell us about the iron horses that carry white men across the prairie," asked Little Fox, a bright-eyed girl of perhaps 10 winters, who had become Clara's most eager student and unofficial assistant. "Do they really breathe fire and smoke like the stories the traders tell? They burn coal to make steam." Clara explained patiently, using a stick to draw diagrams in the dirt that showed how locomotives worked their pistons and driving wheels converting heat energy into mechanical motion. "The fire heats water in a big metal container called a boiler, and the steam pushes rods that turn the wheels. It's not magic, just tools and knowledge working together to accomplish something that would be impossible with human strength alone." The children's questions had grown more sophisticated over the months, moving beyond simple curiosity about mechanical devices to deeper concerns about how these changes would affect their people's future and their relationship with the expanding white civilization. Clara found herself serving not just as a teacher of reading and writing, but as a bridge between two worlds that desperately needed to understand each other better if they were to coexist peacefully. "Will the iron horses bring more white people to our lands?" asked a boy named Swift Arrow, whose father was one of the village's most respected warriors. "And will they want to take our hunting grounds like the fat chief wanted to take our water?" These were questions that Clara couldn't answer with simple diagrams or explanations of mechanical principles. They required discussions about politics, economics, and human nature that challenged her own understanding of the forces reshaping the American frontier. But she tried to be honest about both the opportunities and the threats that progress might bring. Wicasa had become far more than her rescuer and protector during these months. He had evolved into her closest friend and cultural interpreter, helping her navigate the complex social structures that governed Cheyenne society, while sharing stories of his sister Ayanna that kept her memory alive and honored. Their shared trauma had created a bond that transcended racial boundaries, built on mutual respect and a common commitment to ensuring that justice was served for all of Price's victims. "Ayanna would have liked you," Wicasa told Clara one evening as they sat by the fire sharing the day's lessons with the children. "She always said that wisdom comes from understanding different ways of seeing the world, not from rejecting everything that seems foreign or strange." The letter Clara had carried through her ordeal had proven even more valuable than she had initially realized. Working together with Wicasa, the village elders, and a sympathetic army officer from Fort Laramie, who had grown disgusted with the corruption he witnessed in territorial politics, they had crafted a detailed report to federal authorities that combined documentary evidence with eyewitness testimony to create an overwhelming case against Price's criminal organization. The federal response had exceeded their wildest hopes for justice. Investigators dispatched from the territorial capital had uncovered a web of corruption that extended far beyond simple land acquisition schemes or isolated acts of violence. Price's carefully maintained records discovered in a hidden safe in his office after his death revealed that he had been systematically eliminating anyone who stood in the way of his expansion plans, a campaign of murder and intimidation that had claimed at least 12 lives over the past 3 years. The posthumous trial that followed had become a territorial sensation, drawing newspaper reporters from major cities who portrayed it as a dramatic example of frontier justice triumphing over corruption and greed. Clara's testimony, delivered via sworn affidavit to protect her from any remaining associates of Price's organization, had provided the crucial human element that transformed dry legal proceedings into a compelling narrative of survival and resistance that captured the public imagination. The defendant, though deceased, stands accused of crimes that strike at the very foundation of law and order in our territories. The federal prosecutor had declared in his opening statement, "Through witness testimony and documentary evidence, we will show that Amos Price operated a criminal enterprise that used murder, intimidation, and fraud to acquire land and water rights that rightfully belonged to others. But it was the confession of Jacob Morrison Price's former bookkeeper and reluctant accomplice that sealed the case beyond any possibility of appeal. Consumed by guilt after witnessing the mayor's final murderous pursuit of Clara and facing charges as an accessory to multiple murders, Morrison had agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence and relocation to California, where he could start his life over. Mr. Price kept detailed records of everything. Morrison had testified before a packed courthouse, his voice shaking with emotion, as he described years of complicity in crimes that had escalated far beyond anything he had imagined when he first agreed to help falsify land records. Every bribe paid to territorial officials, every threat made to uncooperative landowners, every accident that befell folks who wouldn't sell their property or water rights. He was proud of his efficiency, called it good business practice for a territory too wild for conventional law and order. The trial's outcome had been swift and decisive. Though Amos Price couldn't be punished for his crimes, having paid the ultimate price for his obsession in the flood-swollen canyon, his vast criminal enterprise was completely dismantled. His stolen properties were returned to their rightful owners or their surviving family members. His co-conspirators were either imprisoned or banished from Wyoming territory under threat of federal prosecution, and new laws were enacted to prevent similar abuses of power in the future. Clara's father, Henrik Bell, had not emerged from the scandal unscathed. Word of his role in selling his daughter to a known criminal had spread throughout the territory like wildfire, earning him the contempt of former neighbors and complete social ostracism that made continuing to live in the region impossible. Unable to bear the shame and consumed by guilt over his betrayal of his own child, he had liquidated what remained of the family assets and disappeared into the vast American wilderness to seek redemption or oblivion. But before departing Milbrook forever, Henrik had performed one final act that might have qualified as partial redemption for his failures as a father. A letter had arrived at the Cheyenne village 3 months after Price's death, delivered by a sympathetic trader who had been asked to ensure it reached Clara safely. The envelope bore her name in her father's familiar handwriting, and with trembling hands, she had opened it to find both a detailed confession of his knowledge of Price's criminal activities and something far more precious, a heartfelt apology that acknowledged the full magnitude of his betrayal. My dearest Clara. The letter began in the careful script she remembered from childhood lessons. I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness after what I have done, but I must try to explain what led me to commit the most shameful act of my life. Fear made me weak when I should have been strong. Debt made me desperate when I should have sought other solutions, and pride prevented me from seeing any path forward except the one that destroyed our family and nearly cost you your life. The letter continued for several pages, detailing Henrik's growing awareness of Price's true nature, his futile attempts to convince himself that the marriage would somehow benefit Clara despite all evidence to the contrary, and his crushing realization that he had sentenced his own daughter to death through his cowardice and selfishness. The writing grew more emotional as he described the guilt that consumed him after learning of her escape and the mayor's violent pursuit. "I have spent these months since your disappearance trying to understand how I became the kind of man who would trade his daughter's life for his own financial security," he wrote. "Your mother would be ashamed of what I have become, and I am ashamed of the legacy I have left you. But I want you to know that your escape and the downfall of Amos Price have shown me what true courage looks like. You faced impossible odds with nothing but determination and your grandmother's knife, while I surrendered to despair at the first sign of hardship." The final paragraph had brought tears to Clara's eyes as she read it aloud to Wicasa, the words carrying a weight of genuine remorse that transcended the mere expression of regret. "I am leaving Wyoming territory forever, knowing that I can never repair the damage I have caused or earn the forgiveness I do not deserve. But I want you to know that wherever you have found safety and whatever life you have built for yourself, you have my blessing and my pride. Use the money I am sending to build something good, a school perhaps, where children can learn to be better than their parents were. Your loving but unworthy father, Henrik Bell." Enclosed with the letter was a bank draft for $300, Henrik's entire remaining assets liquidated and sent to his daughter as a final gesture of love and atonement that could never fully balance the scales of justice, but represented his best attempt at making amends. Clara had wept as she read his words, not from anger or resentment, but from the grief of understanding how fear and desperation could corrupt even decent people into making choices that destroyed everything they claimed to value. On a crisp October morning, as Clara sat outside her adopted lodge teaching a mixed group of Cheyenne and white children and the fundamentals of written English, her school had attracted students from nearby settlements whose parents recognized the value of cross-cultural education. An unexpected visitor appeared at the village entrance. The sight of an official delegation approaching caused considerable stirring among the villagers who had learned to be wary of representatives from the territorial government. A federal marshal in a spotless blue uniform rode in accompanied by 2 army escorts, their presence causing considerable stirring among the villagers who had learned to be wary of official representatives following generations of broken treaties and false promises. The marshal dismounted with obvious nervousness at being surrounded by armed warriors, his hand never straying far from his service pistol, despite the clearly peaceful nature of his reception. "Zerbio, Miss Clara Bell," the marshal announced formally, after removing his hat with the stiff courtesy required by military protocol. "I bring official word from Territorial Governor Thomas Moonlight himself. Your courage in exposing the criminal conspiracy led by Amos Price has been recognized at the highest levels of territorial and federal government." The official proclamation he read aloud declared Clara's actions to be exemplary service to territorial justice and federal law enforcement that had prevented further bloodshed and helped establish the rule of law in a region previously dominated by corruption and violence. More substantially, the territorial legislature had voted to award her a monetary prize of $750 in gold coin, more wealth than most frontier families accumulated in several years of backbreaking labor. Furthermore, the marshal continued clearly uncomfortable with the curious stares of Cheyenne children who had never seen such elaborate military regalia. "Governor Moonlight wishes to offer you a position as Territorial Liaison for Indian Affairs, helping to improve communication and understanding between tribal communities and civilian authorities. The salary would be generous, and you would have the full backing of the territorial government in your efforts to prevent future conflicts." The offer represented everything Clara might once have dreamed of achieving: official recognition of her worth and capabilities, financial security that would allow her to live independently, and the opportunity to return to white society, with her reputation not merely restored but significantly enhanced. She could establish herself in Cheyenne City or Denver, perhaps open a school for young women who needed to learn that they possessed options beyond marriage and motherhood. or use her unique experiences to advocate for better treatment of Indian peoples within existing governmental structures. But as Clara considered the marshal's words, watching her students work through their language exercises with the same determination she had once applied to her own survival, she realized that the choice had been made months ago, during countless quiet moments of teaching, learning, and growing into a person she could respect. This village, with its acceptance of her differences and appreciation for her contributions, had become more of a home than Milbrook had ever been. Please convey my deepest gratitude to Governor Moonlight for this generous recognition. Clara replied, her voice steady with the confidence that came from knowing her own mind and heart. But my place is here, helping to build understanding between peoples who have been taught to fear and distrust each other. The reward money will be put to excellent use, establishing a permanent school that serves both white and Indian children, teaching them that cooperation and mutual respect serve everyone better than conflict and suspicion. The marshal nodded with obvious relief at completing his mission, clearly eager to return to more familiar surroundings, where the complexities of frontier justice could be reduced to simple reports and official pronouncements. As his party rode away, kicking up dust clouds that quickly dispersed in the clean prairie air, Clara turned to find Wicasa approaching with a smile that spoke of shared understanding and mutual respect for her decision. "You have chosen the more difficult path," he observed, settling beside her on the woven mat, where her students continued their lessons despite the morning's excitement and the distraction of official visitors. "The easy choice would have been to return to your own people with honor and wealth." "Perhaps." Clara agreed, watching as young minds from two different cultures worked together to master the complexities of written communication that would help them navigate an increasingly interconnected world. But it's a path that leads towards something better than what existed before. My mother used to say that the most worthwhile journeys often require leaving behind everything we thought we wanted in order to discover what we actually need. As the sun climbed higher over the endless plains that had once seemed like a prison of heat and danger, Clara reflected on the unexpected turns that had brought her to this moment of peace and purpose. She had begun this journey as a desperate girl, fleeing an unwanted marriage, carrying nothing but a blood-stained letter and her grandmother's bone-handled knife. She was ending it as a woman who had chosen her own destiny, found her own family among people who valued her contributions to their community, and helped create a small corner of the world where justice had triumphed over tyranny and understanding had overcome prejudice. The letter that had started everything, the document that had exposed Amos Price's crimes and ultimately cost him his life in the flood-swollen canyon, now resided in the territorial archives as evidence of a case that had fundamentally changed frontier law enforcement and established new precedents for federal intervention in territorial corruption. But its greater legacy lived on in the changes it had set in motion. The strengthened protections for Indian communities and the investigations into other suspicious land deals throughout the territory, and the legal precedent that no amount of wealth or political influence could protect criminals from the consequences of their actions when brave people were willing to risk everything to expose the truth. Clara Bell had fled into the wilderness as a victim of circumstance and male authority, but she had returned to civilization as an agent of change and justice. Living proof that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons of war, but with courage, truth, and the determination to build something better from the ashes of what came before. The well at Prairie's edge still stood where it had always been, a stone monument to the moment when two wounded people had found each other and discovered that shared pain could become shared purpose, and that justice delayed need not mean justice denied. In the evening, as the children gathered around the fire to hear stories from both Cheyenne tradition and the wider world beyond their territory, Clara would sometimes look toward the eastern horizon and remember the girl who had crawled through the grass toward that ancient well. That desperate fugitive seemed like a different person now, someone she had once been, but could never be again. The transformation had cost her everything she had once considered important, but it had given her something far more valuable. But the knowledge that she was strong enough to create her own destiny and wise enough to recognize when she had found her true home.